Hola, hola a todos, bienvenidos, gracias por estar con nosotros. Vamos a empezar en un par de minutos, pero bueno, tenemos la fortuna y la dicha de tener aquí al doctor Patrick Murray y también al doctor Rogelio de Jesús Treviño, que ahorita los presentaremos bien, pero bueno, denos un minuto más para los que ya están con nosotros y comenzaremos el webinar. Muchas gracias por estar aquí, les aseguro que será una plática entre colegas, yo no, ustedes entre colegas, pero será muy enriquecedora. Un minuto más y comenzamos. También para los que van entrando, recuerden que al final del webinar tendremos un sorteo para regalar 2 ebooks. Entonces los invitamos a que nos acompañen hasta el final y puedan ser ganadores de alguno de estas, de los libros del doctor Murray. Haremos 2 preguntas al final de la sesión para seleccionar a los ganadores. Entonces espero nos acompañen hasta el final. Pues vamos a comenzar. Por respeto a quien se unió en tiempo y forma. Buenos días, buenas tardes a todos y todas. En nombre del CEBIER quiero darles la más cordial bienvenida a este webinar, un espacio que hemos preparado con mucho entusiasmo para reunir a la comunidad científica y clínica alrededor de un tema que ha transformado la manera en que entendemos, diagnosticamos y combatimos las enfermedades infecciosas. El webinar de hoy lleva por título Medical Microbiology from 1990 to 2026, un recorrido por casi 4 décadas de avances en microbiología médica, desde los métodos diagnósticos tradicionales hasta las herramientas moleculares y genómicas que hoy definen la práctica clínica. Es un viaje que nos permite no solo mirar hacia atrás y valorar el camino recorrido, sino también participar ante los retos y oportunidades que vienen. Y no podíamos pensar en nadie más, en una mejor persona para guiarnos en este recorrido que en nuestro ponente, el doctor Patrick Murray. Dr. Murray, it is truly an honor and privilege to have you with us for this webinar. Para este webinar contamos también con la maravillosa presencia del doctor Rogelio de Jesús Treviño Rangel, a quien agradezco mucho sus atenciones y apoyo. Y a quien me permitiré presentar brevemente. El doctor Treviño es químico farmacéutico biólogo, egresado de la Facultad de Ciencias Médicas de la Universidad Autónoma de Nuevo León. Tiene un máster en micología médica por la Universidad del País Vasco, una maestría en ciencias en microbiología médica, con mención honorífica por parte de la Facultad de Medicina de la Universidad Autónoma de Nuevo León, un doctorado en ciencias con orientación en microbiología médica, summa cum laude, también por la misma universidad. Tiene estancias de investigación en la Universidad de Texas de Houston, en la Universidad de Texas de San Antonio y en el Instituto Pasteur de París. Tiene más de 100 artículos originales en revistas indexadas nacionales e internacionales, más de 1000 citas, un índice H de 18. Autor de más de 11 libros, coautor de 4 capítulos. Ha sido presidente de la Sesión Mexicana de Micología Médica, miembro de la Sociedad Americana de Microbiología, de la Sociedad Mexicana de Infectología y Microbiología Médica, de la Sociedad Española de Microbiología, de la Sociedad Europea de Microbiología Clínica y Enfermedades Infecciosas y de la Sociedad Internacional de Micología Humana y Animal. Actualmente es profesor titular y jefe del Departamento de Microbiología de la Facultad de Medicina de la Universidad Autónoma de Nuevo León, coordinador académico de posgrado, responsable sanitario del Centro Regional de Control de Enfermedades Infecciosas, vocal del Comité Institucional para el Cuidado y Uso de Animales de Laboratorio, y por último, pero no menos importante, es el actual escritor del prólogo de la 10ª edición del libro de microbiología médica del doctor Patrick Murray. Gracias, doctor. Bienvenido.
Al contrario, muchas gracias por la invitación a participar como moderador en este extraordinario webinar. Definitivamente pues agradecer a Elsevier y al doctor Patrick Murray el que nos honre esta mañana con su plática. Y bueno, me permito presentar una breve semblanza del doctor Patrick R. Murray. El doctor Patrick R. Murray obtuvo su doctorado PhD en microbiología por la UCLA. Realizó formación de posgrado en microbiología clínica en la Universidad Mayo en Rochester, Minnesota, y fue director de los laboratorios de microbiología clínica del Burns Hospital y profesor de medicina y patología en la Washington University en 1976 a 1999. En este año se incorporó a la Facultad de Medicina de la Universidad de Maryland y en el 2001 aceptó el cargo de científico senior y jefe de microbiología en los Institutos Nacionales de Salud, NIH. En julio del 2011 se retiró del NIH y aceptó el cargo de vicepresidente de microbiología mundial en BD Diagnostics, donde trabajó hasta su jubilación en el año 2022. Es miembro de la Academia Mexicana de Microbiología, así como de la Sociedad de Enfermedades Infecciosas de América, ITSA, expresidente de la Junta Americana de Microbiología Médica, ex editor en jefe del Manual de Microbiología Médica de la ASM de 1990 al año 2010, también ex director de la revista Journal of Clinical Microbiology, que es un referente, y a lo largo de su carrera, pues formó parte de numerosos comités editoriales. Es autor de más de 300 artículos de investigación y 22 libros. Ha recibido numerosos premios, entre ellos el premio de la ASM a la investigación en microbiología clínica en el año 1993, el premio ASM al liderazgo en microbiología clínica en el año 2002, el premio ASM Founders al servicio distinguido en el año 2010 y el premio de reconocimiento profesional ABM-ABMLI en el año 2011. Además, también fue distinguido con el premio Pasteur a la trayectoria en el año 2007, los premios del director del Centro Clínico del NIH a la atención del paciente en el 2006 y en investigación en el año 2010, y premio del director del NIH a la investigación en el año 2007. Dr. Patrick Murray, it is a great honor for me to introduce you, and I'm extremely grateful that you accept the invitation to give us this talk entitled Medical Microbiology from 1990 to 2026. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First, I want to thank Elsevier for the invitation to make a presentation. And then secondly, it was interesting, before this started, I was talking with Alberto and Professor Regilio about my experiences giving lectures. And one of the things I really enjoyed during my career was the opportunity to travel to different countries and to meet with students and teachers and just talk about microbiology. And one of the favorite areas that I had was going to Latin America, as well as going to Spain and talking to the Spanish-speaking students and teachers in those countries. Unfortunately, I can't travel like I used to, but this is maybe the next best thing, is being able to be here. I also decided, first I was going to prepare a PowerPoint presentation to sort of organize my thoughts and present this. And then I started thinking that as students in particular, you hear PowerPoint presentations every day. And what I didn't want this to be is to seem like a formal lecture. What I really wanted was to make this a story about how I got really involved in writing about microbiology and why it was important for me to work with companies like Elsevier to be able to produce these books. And so what I'd like to do is to start from the beginning, and that is the first edition of Medical Microbiology, which was published in 1990, and really think about it that I started writing it maybe 4 years before that. So that was 40 years ago. And to look at microbiology today, it's much different than what it was 40 years ago. But there are also a lot of similarities, and that's really the point of what I'm going to try to discuss, what the similarities and differences are in learning microbiology today. What I'd like to do, though, is go back almost 20 years before that, and in 1969, that's when I took my first microbiology course as a graduate student with medical students. So almost 60 years ago, and that makes me feel old when I say that, but almost 60 years ago, I sat in a class on medical microbiology. It was taught by one professor, which is very different from what most courses are today. One professor who was actually excellent. And we used one textbook for the course that had 5 lectures a week and 2 labs for a full year. Now, microbiology, the way it's taught today, is much more condensed than that. But that's what it was when I took my first microbiology course as a graduate student. And the reason I mention that is because the textbook that we were using by famous microbiologists, I'm not going to mention the textbook, but by famous microbiologists, including Nobel laureate, that textbook was referred to by the students as the Book of Pain. And the reason was sort of as the way they set up the book and what their goals were. And I made some notes about this just so I would be accurate. And the Book of Pain, when obviously the authors didn't call it a Book of Pain, their focus was, as it was described, heavily on molecular and genetic aspects of microbes. That was their focus, molecular and genetic aspects. And the later editions were described as updated with expanding molecular biology discoveries. Now, personally, I find that type of information interesting. Much of my background in research and also in teaching, those aspects can help describe how organisms cause disease. But as you look at the focus of their books and as they described it, one word is missing, and that's clinical. And the students referred to it as a book of pain because they were fed tremendous amounts of information. Again, 5 days a week, they had lectures and 2 labs each week. They were fed tremendous amount of information, and rarely was it tied in with what they needed to know as either clinical microbiologists or physicians. And that's when I recognized early on that the books were missing something. And I would say there are a tremendous number of books that were published then and even today. And I felt at that time those books fell short because they didn't emphasize the clinical aspects of the information they were being presented. One other experience that I'll share, and this was true primarily when I was in St. Louis at Washington University, for professors, for their livelihood, for their fame, it's not made primarily in the lecture hall. It's made by doing research and becoming experts on particular organisms or particular diseases. And so the way microbiology was taught when I was in St. Louis at Washington University was that we'd have a number of lecturers that would get up and talk about their expertise, the organism that they're famous for. And that would be wonderful if it's an individual lecture, but as part of a diagnostic course, what you end up hearing is lots of information about their research experience, which again isn't necessarily relevant to what the clinical students need to know. And so that was where I felt there was a lack of useful information in a textbook. And so the challenges that we found in teaching medical microbiology was that every year there's new diseases discovered or old diseases that have new presentations or a new group of patients that may be infected with those organisms. So take example, we have immunocompromised patients. Well, now they're getting infected with organisms that previously really weren't considered that important or that pathogenic. But in an immunocompromised patient, yes, that is the case. And we also see new clinical presentations of old diseases. So there's a lot of information that we want the students to be able to know. We're blessed with an abundance of information, but the problem, the dilemma for the students, and again, we put this in our preface, the very first edition, the dilemma of the student and too often the educator is to sort through the plethora of information and glean what is considered to be important principles. And so our challenge was, how do we convey these important principles with all of this information? So what we felt was needed, and again, I'll reading from the preface, the real need for a textbook is to offer appropriate weight and balance, and yet a concise presentation, focusing at all times on what a student truly needs to know. And so that's our approach to writing about clinical microbiology, medical microbiology. Some of the other things that we said in the preface of the very first edition was that we would focus on relationships between the fundamental properties of microorganisms and the diseases caused by these microorganisms. To me, I don't think it's particularly useful for me to give a litany of information about all the properties that an organism has, unless we take that information and tie it to the diseases they cause. I think it becomes important if we can explain how they cause a disease so that the students have some framework for remembering that information. We also, and again in the preface, avoided presenting all aspects of cellular biology, genetics, and immunology. And again, I find that information useful and I find it interesting, but not particularly for the medical student. And so as we look at all of the information available, as we develop a story about an organism and the diseases it causes, we have to pick and choose what information does the student really need to know in order to be able to understand that organism and the disease process it causes. We said that we tried to follow a consistent format, presenting each group of organisms with a discussion of their physiology and structure, epidemiology, associated clinical syndromes, laboratory diagnosis, treatment, prevention, and control of disease. Now, again, depending on who the audience is, we may emphasize different aspects of that. For the medical student, clinical disease and how the organism causes that disease becomes really important. Diagnostics are also important for the medical student, but much less so than if it's a microbiologist that's going to be working in a diagnostic lab. Now, that's where I've worked most of my career. And so I have a tremendous appreciation for diagnostics. And I know a tremendous amount of information about diagnostics, but I don't think the medical student needs to know all that. So one of the challenges as an educator and a writer is to figure out who my audience is and what information do they really need to know. And then how do I present that information in a way that it makes sense to them and it makes it easy for them to remember the facts that we want them to have. So for each of the chapters, we had chapter summaries, we had illustrated figures, summary tables and boxes, clinical cases, and study questions, each of which is designed to make it easier for the student to remember information, as well as for the student to go back and review information. It's, as most students know, if you're getting ready to take an exam and you have to do a review, you want to have some help in understanding what do you need to review in order to remember the information that we consider to be important. So that's why we have many of the summaries and things. And I'll come back to that in a second. So as we revised medical microbiology, we did it based on our experience as educators. Myself and my other authors have been teaching medical students, graduate students, infectious disease physicians for many years. And so based on our experience in doing that and what we find they want to know, what they need to know, and what we can effectively convey, that's what frames the way we write and the way we teach. And so we have to remember that we have a tremendous amount of information that we're trying to present. Now we can make that concise, we condense it, but we also have students that learn by different pathways. Some are visual learners, some have no problem memorizing facts, a variety of different approaches to education. And so again, what we try to do in a textbook is to give them options for them to be able to learn. So yes, we have summary boxes. Yes, we have detailed descriptions sometimes of pathogenesis, and we have clinical pictures and clinical cases to reinforce what we're trying to say, each for a different approach. Now, one of the questions that I thought about, and that comes up much more frequently today, is why do we need a textbook? We have the internet. We now have AI that'll analyze the internet and tell us what we should know. Isn't that sufficient? Well, unfortunately, at this point today, I don't think it is. When I write a chapter, when I talk about a specific organism, what I do is look at countless number of research articles, look at countless numbers of reviews. I think about how the organism can cause disease. I think about what aspects of that do the students need to know, and then how much detail. In many cases, we've eliminated detail because although I think it's interesting, I don't think the student needs to be burdened with that. And so as we try to put together a story and then condense it in a way that I can say what maybe in a few sentences took many hours doing research to be able to put that information together, I think currently the internet, or even with AI, they still struggle to figure out what information is important, how to convey that in a way that it's concise, accurate, and comprehensive. Now, again, I'm impressed with how far computers have gone. Now, you have to remember, 1990, there weren't personal computers. So life is very different than when I first started writing this textbook. But I think at some point in the future, we will be there where I don't need to continue writing. You'll have another, maybe better source of information. But as of today, I wouldn't have published the last edition if I thought we were at that point today. So just a point, we can come back to that in questions if somebody wants to discuss that. I think it would be interesting. What I also wanted to do is talk about changes over 10 editions. So again, we're looking at roughly a 40-year period of time when I started writing the first edition to where we are in today's 10th edition. So some of the changes that we've seen. The first edition had 4 senior authors and 6 contributing authors. And at the time, I felt that was maybe the right approach to take. Many other textbooks have taken that approach. One of the challenges I found was getting consistency from chapter to chapter and by each author. And I began to realize that much of what I asked other people to do, I already knew, or I could find the information, or I had colleagues that could do that. So today we have 3 authors, and the 3 authors started in the 5th edition. Myself and 2 other authors started in the 5th edition alone, and we've continued that then for the next 6 editions. I write most of the introduction and all of the bacteriology. Ken Rosenthal writes the virology section and immunology, and Mike Fowler writes the mycology and parasitology. And I think each of us do it in a comprehensive, consistent way. So I'm very pleased with the way we've set that up. As I look at the number of pages and the number of chapters from the 1st edition to the 10th edition, there's some interesting insights that I saw with that. We've added immunology because I think it's become much more important to at least have a few chapters devoted to the immune system, because it's both important for our, how do I say this, for our protection from diseases, but also it plays a role in pathogenesis. And so we wanted to emphasize the role of the immune system as we talked about disease with these organisms. We've added the microbiome, and I'll come back to the microbiome in a few minutes, but it really provides a new concept of infectious diseases. Historically, we thought of infectious diseases as caused by one organism causes one disease. We expanded that by knowing one organism can cause multiple diseases. But what we now find is a population of organisms can cause a single disease. And actually, it's not even just infectious diseases, it's many metabolic diseases and so forth. So the microbiome becomes extremely important. And so we've added that chapter, and we've had that since the 8th edition. We've de-emphasized diagnostics. And the reason is because the focus in diagnostics, and this was a focus in my first class with 2 labs a week, was how you identify organisms by their biochemical properties. When I was involved at the NIH, we initiated a very comprehensive program in both genomics, using sequencing for identification of organisms, and then mass spectrometry, where we can identify virtually all of the bacteria and mycobacteria, most of the fungi, with mass spectrometry. And so the laboratories are changing. Does the medical student need to know that? Only they need to know that some of these technologies are very rapid, where it may take days or weeks or even months to identify some organisms, like a mycobacterium. Now we can do it in a matter of an hour or 2. So I think that concept of rapid diagnostics is important, but the details, no, I don't think the students need that. I found that when I looked over everything from the 1st to the 10th edition, we've expanded greatly our discussion of fungi and parasites. And I think the reason for that is with fungi, we have many more immunocompromised patients, and so they're susceptible to many more fungal infections than previously. And so it was important to be able to emphasize that. And with parasites, it's a global disease. And so as we travel worldwide, we get exposed to things that we wouldn't see in our own home country. And so parasitology also became important. Bacteriology and virology increased much less than what we saw with mycology and parasitology. Not to de-emphasize that, but that we could concentrate on what the students really needed to know and not get bogged down with a lot of esoteric data that maybe is not relevant to their ability to practice medicine. We dedicated chapters to antibacterial and antiviral vaccines. And in this era, at least in the United States, where vaccines, I think, have received a really bad name, we really wanted to emphasize the importance of preventing disease and maybe not focus so much on how you treat diseases. So prevention becomes really important, and vaccines play a critically important role there. As we looked at some of the other changes over time, we had a table listing organisms and their derivation of names. Now, again, that may seem pretty esoteric and silly for a medical student to know. I was the one that introduced that. And the reason is I have a really difficult time remembering facts. I'm not the type of student that can remember everything I ever was exposed to. So for me, it was always useful to know sort of the history of something to help me remember it. And I'll give you an example. The organism Francisella tularensis. If you don't have any background for that, that's just memorizing 2 words and then trying to remember the diseases associated with that organism. Well, Francisella tularensis was named after Edwin Francis, who found the bacteria, and tularensis comes from Tulare County in California, where the disease was first recognized. Now, for some students, that table is totally worthless. It doesn't mean a thing. But for students, particularly ones like me, that may become very important. So I finally can say, now I know why that organism has that name. And you may not remember Edwin Francis's first name. It doesn't matter. Francis is what's supposed to help you. The same thing, you may not remember where Tulare County is, but that may help you remember the species name tularensis. We continue to expand the summary tables, and particularly in the 9th edition, that became, or the 10th, well, we introduced in the 9th edition, and in 10th edition, it's critically important. So at the very beginning of the chapter, each one of the chapters on organisms, we list a summary of everything that's going to be in that chapter. So for a student doing a review, you just go to that summary table, read through it, and it should spark a memory of what you'd heard previously in the lecture. We've added clinical pictures. We started in the 7th edition, where we show you pictures of patients with specific diseases or x-rays or other pathology reports. Anything that's going to help you have a visual spot to remember information about that organism. We added clinical cases. We started that with the 2nd edition and expanded it in the 6th edition. I always found, particularly as I was trying to remember the medical aspects of the information I was presenting, I always found it useful to be able to tie it with a clinical case. So you have a picture of a patient with a disease, and it made it much easier to remember that information. The electronic version of the textbook was added in the 5th edition, and for some students, that's the way they've learned. Personally, for me, I don't use the electronic version very often because I like printed material. That's the same reason I read books holding a book in my hand and not a computer screen. But that's my age. I think for the younger students, the electronic version can become very useful. We began in the 6th edition with, at the very introduction, we would have a case, a clinical case, and some questions about that. And it's not that we expect you to be able to answer those questions before you read the chapter or listen to a lecture, but it helps you focus on what we think is going to be important So as you read the chapter or you hear a lecture, that information then will spark an answer to the questions we initially posed. And we also have a summary case and questions at the end of each chapter. And that's to really make sure that you caught the important information as you went through that individual chapter. So in each case, we tie together at the beginning and at the end clinical cases and questions to help frame your learning process. I'm trying to look and see what else I had in my notes. We've added practical exam questions for each section. And I think it's important when you look at it, when you think about bacteriology as an example, your exam question, the answers that are posed can touch on a number of different chapters in bacteriology. And as we continue to refine that, it may not just be restricted to bacteriology, but the answers could involve also parasites, viruses, or fungi. So again, just to help the students be able to think more broadly about the information that they're being exposed to. And then in the 10th edition, what we've done is we've really tried to add another aspect. Up until the 10th edition, the primary focus was on organisms and the diseases they cause and how they cause those diseases. For a medical student or for a physician, you're not presented with an organism, you're presented with a clinical syndrome. And so we also wanted to help the students look at this from a different perspective. So in the 10th edition, we added section 8, where we talked about infectious disease syndromes like lower respiratory tract infections or urinary tract infections. And for that, we gave the disease and the list of bacteria, viruses, fungi, and parasites that can cause that disease. So again, what we're trying to do is help the students be able to think about microbiology in a very broad view, both from the organisms causing disease and the disease and what organisms cause that. And so that was the approach that we've taken in medical microbiology. Now, maybe in the last couple of minutes, what I'd like to do is talk about my other book that, again, Elsevier publishes, and I'm not sure if they had a picture, but that's the book. And I know you can't read it because it's reversed, but it's Basic Medical Microbiology. And I look at this, it's very important from my perspective, I look at this as a supplement or complementary book, not a replacement book for medical microbiology. Now, medical students particularly are confronted with a number of abbreviated short books, like Medical Microbiology for Dummies. First of all, I'd find that offensive and would never buy a book if it's for dummies, because that's an insult to myself. But the approach is to be able to say, here's what you need to know about microbiology, and we'll condense it and we'll get rid of all the stuff you don't need to know. And again, I would challenge, that's maybe the opposite of what I was confronted with 60 years ago in my first microbiology course, where they threw everything at us and said, figure out what you need to know. These books, they take a little bit of information and says, this is all you need to know. I think that would be okay if it was comprehensive enough and if it was accurate. And I hate to say this, but, well, I don't hate to say it, I'll say it. Many of those books have incredible numbers of inaccuracies. And so that was I'm trying to figure out how to say this. That was why I decided it was important to be able to write a more condensed book that would allow the students to be able to look at microbiology and use this as a complement to what the more comprehensive book is. And so we have a number of summary tables, we have a number of clinical cases, and we have review questions here. In the second edition of this, which was published in 2024, I really expanded the number of clinical cases because I felt that really is the easiest way for medical students to learn about microbiology. So you had summary tables in the beginning, clinical cases in the middle section of the book, and then exam questions at the very end. So I would say it's worth looking at the book. You may find it very helpful. You may find it not necessary because with medical microbiology, you have a lot of the summaries there, not as many of the clinical cases. But again, what I try to do is to make the subject interesting and fun for the students to learn. And hopefully no student has ever referred to one of my books as a book of pain. If they do, then I haven't been successful. So with that, let me stop. And Dr. Virgilio, I'll let you lead the opportunity for the students to ask questions.
Thank you, Dr. Murray. Let me read some questions of the audience. Daniela Carrasco, Dr. Murray, after all these years in microbiology, what is one thing we teach students today that you think may be completely different in the future?
So let me think. So, all right, I have to, takes time to organize my thoughts. Maybe at my age, it's okay. I think that if I look back, and actually I did this, when I took all 10 editions, I laid them all out and I went through them all. Much of the information that's in the first edition is in the 10th edition. It doesn't really change. We may understand a little bit more, well, we understand a lot more about organisms that cause disease. And yes, there are new diseases and new clinical presentations. But I think much of that still is the same. I think if we look at what's important for the students to understand 60 years ago and today is how organisms cause disease, because any discussion about the biology of the organism, I think, is only relevant if that helps us understand how they cause the disease they cause. So if I look over that period, yes, there are changes, but not dramatic changes. Now, if I understand the question correctly, the real question is, what is going to be a dramatic change? Now, I mentioned AI and the internet. That's going to be a dramatic change in how we learn. And that's coming in the future. But if I look at the subject matter, the dramatic changes in the microbiome, we thought of Koch's postulates as one of the first things that we're taught as a microbiologist, that you have one organism that causes one disease and how to prove it with Koch's postulates. We know a little bit more. One organism can cause multiple diseases. But with the microbiome, what we find is a community of organisms are responsible for disease. And it could be a whole spectrum of diseases, not just restricted to infectious diseases. So if I'm going to look at where we're going to see the biggest change in what students will learn, it's going to be our understanding of how the microbiome both keeps us healthy and is responsible for when we get sick, and then how we do diagnostics, how we do treatment, and a whole variety of other aspects. So I think the one thing I would say where we're going to see changes is in the microbiome.
Excellent. We have one more question from Daniela Carrasco. What is one thing you wish every medical student understood about microbiology before becoming a doctor?
First of all, don't refer to learning about it as a book of pain. I heard a presentation once, and this was by a fourth-year medical student who was going to become a urologist. And her concept of treatment of diseases was you only need to know 4 antibiotics. And I probably, first of all, I should have called them antimicrobials, because I think she was referring to 1 for bacteria, 1 for fungi, 1 virus, and 1 parasites. That is a gross oversimplification. And today we recognize that antibiotic resistance has become tremendously common and deadly, and that life is not going to be managed with 4 antimicrobials. So to sort of broadly answer the question that was posed, I think it's important to recognize that microbiology is complex. There's a lot of organisms, a lot of diseases. I think for the majority of medical students, it's going to be a problem. It's going to be a problem to remember all of that information. And it's why so many medical students specialize in specific areas, including infectious diseases or pathology or microbiology. I think for most students as physicians, I think they have to accept the fact that it is a complex subject, to rely on experts that can help them understand that, as well as rely on, sorry, I'm not used to talking this long, as well as rely on textbooks and reference books to help supplement their knowledge, not to be afraid to admit that they don't know everything. I'm one of the first to say, if we get into a discussion about a particular microbe, I'll be the first to say I don't know that information, but I can find the information pretty quickly through resources that I have and that are available to students. So I think the answer to the question is accept the fact that it's a complex subject, should be a fun subject, an interesting subject, but there are resources to help you master it.
Okay. Next question, Dr. Murray. If antimicrobial resistance is an inevitable evolutionary process, what strategies do you believe could truly change its trajectory rather than simply delay it?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I did a lot of lectures on antimicrobial resistance, particularly as I traveled throughout the world. And we talked about programs that should be initiated to help control it. I think, I'll be honest, I think we're only modestly successful. I do think we have tools, particularly with computerized laboratory records, where we can monitor and track resistant organisms. I think it's inevitable that most organisms will develop resistance if antibiotics are if specific antibiotics are widely used. So it's always going to be a challenge. I don't think, and pharmaceutical companies may disagree with me, but I don't think we're going to come up with magic bullets for most diseases. I think we have to use antibiotics in a prudent way. I like to refer to the fact that I think all antibiotics are toxic. At some point, an antibiotic, which may be very effective, is going to kill organisms in our microbiome that we don't want it to have killed. So most antibiotics, at least antibacterial and antifungals, are going to be considered toxic in my mind. Antivirals may be less so. I think I made a brief reference to this earlier. I think all of the discussion about vaccines is totally missing the point. Vaccines are critically important for preventing infections. and to see diseases that should be just historic relics reoccur, I think is shameful. And I think we have to continue to push for the value of vaccines to prevent diseases, as well as other infection control practices. But it's a balance between trying to manage infections by treatment and infection control, and trying to prevent infections with, again, infection control and vaccines.
Excellent. Angel Leon, given the rapid spread of pan-drug resistant organisms, what is your perspective on integrating rapid susceptibility testing, synergistic combination therapies, or non-traditional approaches like bacteriophages or antivirulence agents into current clinical protocols?
Yeah, and again, this is sort of plays off of the last question about how to manage these very resistant organisms. When I first started, again, 60 years ago, it was rare to talk about a resistant bacteria. Less than 1% of the Staph aureus were susceptible to oxacillin, methicillin. Now, obviously, it's much different. TB, the same thing. I was involved with a lot of development of diagnostics, and rapid susceptibility testing was always a goal of ours. I think we have made tremendous progress in rapid identification of organisms. And in some ways, with molecular tools, we've made progress in rapid detection of resistance of organisms, less so rapid susceptibility of organisms to different antibiotics. And I'm not sure, I know it's important, but I'm not sure the real value of rapid susceptibility tests. And I base that on the fact that most rapid susceptibility tests right now require us to isolate the organism. So if it takes a significant period of time, whether it's hours or days, to isolate an organism, the value of doing rapid susceptibility tests a few hours earlier is very limited. I do think alternative approaches, and maybe I'm not an expert now, so I'll say this with some caution. I do think alternative testing methods or treatment is what I really want to say, treatment methods is going to be significant. Bacteriophages may be one of those. There may be others that are more important, and maybe that we modify our microbiome to be able to take care of disease. So I do think we'll see alternative methods, but I don't think those are near term. I think we're talking 5 to 10 years out, maybe even longer than that. We may have limited success, like a bacteriophage, with a very specific organism and the diseases it causes, but more widespread use of that, I think, is limited. And in part, and again, I'll look in the US, I think the biggest roadblock that I saw was not in development of tests or development of treatment modalities, but getting them approved. And so I think that's going to be the challenge, at least in the US. In your individual countries, you have to look at that and decide, is that also a challenge for new tests or new diagnostics for your country?
Excellent. The last question. Good afternoon, Dr. Murray. Given the rise of resistant fungal pathogens such as Candida auris, driven by climate change, to what extent are next-generation sequencing tools combined with artificial intelligence transforming daily diagnostic turnaround times in the laboratory?
So when I was making my presentation, I made a comment that I didn't think it was important for students to focus on diagnostics because most diagnostic labs look at biochemical identification. And what I said was, when I was the director of microbiology at the NIH, we developed a number of molecular tools for identification of organisms and for understanding pathogenic aspects of those organisms. We also developed mass spectrometry for the very rapid identification of bacteria and mycobacteria and fungi. I think there clearly is a role for some of these tools. Certainly in the clinical laboratory, the role of mass spectrometry is replacing many of our identification techniques. We use sequencing primarily for epidemiologic investigations. We also used it to be able to identify virulence factors of organisms and make a prediction. Is this particular organism, either because it's more virulent or has resistant markers, is this going to be a problem for treatment, and how do we adjust for that? The downside right now of sequencing, or downsides, is both the time it takes and the cost. Both of those are going down significantly. I think they will play an important role. I'm not sure how much of a role, I haven't really thought too much about this lately, but what I was going to say, I'm not sure how much of a role this is going to be in diagnostics and treatment. But that may change. That may change very rapidly. And I'd have to, again, review the recent literature and think about that to be able to expand on that answer.
Excellent. Dr. Murray, thank you very much for this outstanding talk and for sharing your invaluable experience and insights with us. It has truly been a privilege to have you with us today.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. It's been my privilege, though.
Damos paso al sorteo.
Sí, sí, doctor, muchas gracias. Dr. Murray, thank you very much for sharing your expertise, your knowledge. It was a privilege to have you with us today. Really, really, we appreciate it. Vamos a pasar al sorteo de los ebooks. Vamos a hacer 2 preguntas. Por favor, en el chat pongan la respuesta y vamos a tomar en cuenta, obviamente, la respuesta correcta, pero también la velocidad con la que lo hagan. Las primeras 2 respuestas correctas, el equipo del Sevier se va a comunicar con ustedes para informarles la forma en que les haremos llegar el ebook. Perfecto. Doctor, ¿me ayudas con las preguntas?
Thank you very much.
Estás en mute, doctor.
Y una disculpa. La primera pregunta para la audiencia es: ¿en qué años se publicó la primera edición del libro de texto Medical Microbiology, Microbiología Médica de Murray?
Listo. La segunda, doctor. Ahorita el equipo va a tomar captura de quienes contestaron primero, no se preocupen, y les haremos llegar su ebook. Nos ponemos en contacto con ustedes.
La segunda pregunta para el sorteo del ebook es: ¿cuáles son los autores de esta 10ª edición de Microbiología Médica?
Listo, con que lo pongan en el chat, quien lo haga de manera más rápida y correcta, les haremos llegar su ebook. Pues, muchísimas gracias. No me queda más que agradecer, Dr. Murray. Thank you very much for your knowledge. Doctor Rogelio, muchas gracias. Gracias a todos nuestros doctores y doctoras que nos acompañaron. Y aprovecho el espacio para invitarlos. La siguiente semana tendremos también un webinar de patología, donde estaremos con autores del libro Robbins, Patología Estructural y Funcional. Y también tenemos un webinar de microbiología, donde estaremos con autores del libro Moore de Embriología Clínica. Agradezco mucho su atención. Que tengan una excelente tarde.
Muchas gracias. Nos vemos.
Hasta luego.